This mansion was never meant to be sold. It was built to hold wealth in place, to turn ambition into permanence and size into security. But over time, what was meant to protect power began to weigh it down. What stands here is not collapse, not scandal, but a quieter truth. That sometimes the thing built to last the longest is simply too much. The mansion rose long before the nation learned how to speak the language of restraint. It emerged from a period when American wealth was still unsure of its own legitimacy, when money arrived faster than tradition, and architecture was asked to perform a task far greater than shelter. In the second half of the 19th century, as New York City stretched northward from its colonial core and industry rewrote the scale of private fortune, stone and space became instruments of authority. They were expected to persuade a skeptical society that new wealth deserved old reverence. Few families understood this more clearly than the Astors. Astor mansions did not simply occupy land. They dominated it. Their façades borrowed heavily from European precedent, drawing on Renaissance palazzi and French aristocratic townhouses, not out of imitation alone, but as a calculated act of translation. The Astors were converting money into permanence. In a republic suspicious of hereditary power, architecture offered a workaround. Walls could suggest lineage where bloodlines could not. Cornices could imply continuity where history was thin. Every column, every balustrade, every carefully proportioned room participated in a silent argument. That American wealth, if arranged with sufficient discipline and grandeur, could claim the same authority once reserved for titled families across the Atlantic. These mansions were positioned with intention. Fifth Avenue was not yet a commercial corridor, but a proving ground for social hierarchy. Its width allowed distance, its elevation suggested oversight, and its location separated those who ruled from those who served. The Astor residences turned private space into a public statement. They announced who belonged at the center of American high society and who would remain outside its gates. In this sense, architecture functioned as law before law intervened. Entry was not prohibited by statute but by design. Thresholds were narrow, staircases deliberate, rooms arranged to control movement, visibility, and silence. Power revealed itself not through spectacle, but through order. Inside the interiors disciplined behavior as much as they displayed wealth. Drawing rooms enforced posture, dining rooms regulated conversation, ballrooms measured social worth by proximity to the hosts. These were not indulgent spaces in the modern sense. They were managerial. The mansion organized people as carefully as factories organized labor. In doing so, it reflected the deeper logic of the Gilded Age, that wealth, to remain stable, must be managed relentlessly, even within the home. The Astor Mansion was less a retreat than a command center, calibrated to sustain dominance through ritual, routine, and exclusion. Yet embedded within this architectural confidence was a quieter truth. The very need for such monumental reinforcement betrayed anxiety. Old European elites inherited authority invisibly. They did not need to announce it in stone. The Astors, by contrast, were constructing legitimacy as they lived within it. Their mansions were arguments, not inheritances. They stood as defenses against social volatility, immigration, industrial unrest, and the persistent American suspicion of aristocracy. The scale of the buildings reflected not only wealth, but fear. Fear that money alone might not be enough. Fear that social position could dissolve without constant reinforcement. As New York modernized, these mansions became islands within a rapidly changing city. Electric lights replaced gas lamps beyond their gates. Tenements rose only blocks away. Railways accelerated movement and disrupted isolation. The mansion, once a symbol of control, now required ever greater effort to maintain its separation from the surrounding world. Servants multiplied, protocols thickened, privacy narrowed. The architecture, once designed to project stability, began absorbing strain. Rooms built for ceremony struggled to adapt to new rhythms of life. Space that once enforced hierarchy now revealed its rigidity. In time, the mansion's authority would prove conditional. Social rules hardened inside even as they softened outside. The Astor name remained powerful, but the environment that had sustained it was already eroding. Architecture could delay change, but it could not cancel it. Stone preserved memory, not dominance. The mansion continued to stand, but the society it was meant to stabilize was quietly shifting beneath its foundations. This documentary begins here, not at collapse, but at construction, not at scandal, but at intention. Because to understand how the Astor fortune exposed the fragility of American high society, one must first understand how carefully that society was built, room by room, facade by facade, in an age that believed permanence could be engineered. The authority the Astor Mansion projected was not accidental, nor was it static. It evolved alongside the city that surrounded it, adapting to pressures that were both visible and deeply structural. By the late 19th century, New York was no longer a mercantile town aspiring toward gentility. It had become an industrial capital whose pace threatened every established hierarchy. Immigration reshaped neighborhoods, labor unrest challenged ownership, and wealth multiplied faster than custom could absorb. Within this environment, the Astor Mansion functioned as both refuge and instrument, attempting to impose an older logic of order onto a society accelerating beyond its control. Social authority in this period did not rely solely on wealth. It required recognition, and recognition required choreography. The Astors understood that money without acceptance was unstable. Their response was to institutionalize social power through ritual. Dinners, balls, charity events, and private gatherings followed strict hierarchies that were rarely written but universally enforced. Invitations were currency. Seating arrangements carried consequence. Silence itself became a form of discipline. The mansion provided the stage upon which these rules could be enacted repeatedly, reinforcing a social grammar that privileged lineage over novelty, discretion over display. Yet this system depended on constant maintenance. The Astors were not simply wealthy, they were administrators of status. The mansion demanded labor to remain authoritative. Servants trained not merely in service, but in invisibility. Grounds kept immaculate to suggest inevitability rather than effort. Interiors preserved according to standards that resisted fashion. Every detail signaled continuity in a city defined by disruption. The mansion's stability was performative, sustained by repetition rather than inevitability. Beyond its walls, however, the economic foundation of this authority was changing. Industrial capital increasingly favored liquidity over land, networks over permanence. New fortunes rose rapidly, unburdened by the social codes that governed Fifth Avenue. Steel, railroads, oil, and finance generated wealth at a scale that challenged the Astor's dominance, not only economically, but culturally. These newcomers were less patient with exclusion and less impressed by inherited position. They built their own mansions, often larger, often louder, diluting the Astor monopoly on architectural prestige. This competition exposed a structural weakness. High society relied on scarcity to function. Its power came from exclusion, from the belief that access was limited and meaningful. But as wealth expanded, scarcity collapsed. Architecture alone could no longer enforce hierarchy. Mansions multiplied, social calendars crowded, and distinctions blurred. The very tools the Astors had used to secure their position were now available to rivals who did not share their values or restraints. Inside the mansion, the effects were subtle but accumulating. Rituals grew more rigid as their influence waned. Etiquette hardened into dogma. The social order became less adaptive, more brittle. What had once been flexible authority began to resemble insulation. The mansion protected its inhabitants from change, but it also isolated them from reality. Decisions were filtered through tradition rather than necessity. The architecture that once organized power now limited perception. This insulation had consequences beyond reputation. Maintaining these properties required immense resources. Staffing, maintenance, taxes, and constant refurbishment consumed capital that could no longer be easily replaced. The Astor fortune, rooted in real estate and cautious investment, struggled to match the explosive returns of newer industries. The mansion, once an asset, began to function as a liability. Its grandeur required obedience to a lifestyle that no longer aligned with economic advantage. As the 20th century approached, the Astor Mansion stood increasingly as a monument to a social system out of alignment with its surroundings. Its rooms echoed with traditions that mattered less each year. Its gates marked boundaries that fewer people respected. The building remained impressive, but its authority was no longer unquestioned. The fragility of American high society was not announced by scandal or collapse, but by quiet irrelevance. The mansion still stood, but it no longer commanded the city around it. This tension between permanence and adaptability defines the next stage of the story. For the actors, architecture had once been a solution. It was about to become a warning. The transformation from dominance to vulnerability did not arrive as a single rupture. It unfolded gradually through shifts in law, economics, and public perception that the mansion itself could neither absorb nor resist. By the early 20th century, the Astor residences along Fifth Avenue occupied some of the most valuable land in the nation, yet their value was increasingly abstract. The city around them no longer measured importance by frontage or facade. It measured efficiency, access, and adaptability. The mansion, designed for permanence, now existed within an economy that rewarded movement. Urban policy accelerated this imbalance. Zoning laws, property taxation, and infrastructure expansion altered the calculus of land ownership. What had once been a symbol of strategic placement became a financial burden. Heating vast interiors, staffing large households, and maintaining aging structures imposed costs that no longer translated into social leverage. The mansion's presence inflated taxes without generating income. In a city racing upward, horizontally expansive estates became economically irrational. The Astors possessed land that could no longer justify its own existence under modern conditions. At the same time, cultural authority shifted decisively away from private households. Influence migrated toward institutions, corporations, and media. The mansion, once a center of decision-making and negotiation, was displaced by boardrooms and offices. Power became less personal, more bureaucratic. Social rituals lost their regulatory function. Invitations no longer controlled access to opportunity. Wealth circulated through systems indifferent to pedigree. The Astor Mansion, meticulously calibrated for an earlier form of power, found itself disconnected from the mechanisms that now govern society. This disconnection exposed a deeper truth about American high society. Unlike European aristocracies, it lacked formal legal protection. Titles were social, not statutory. Authority depended on consensus, not mandate. Once that consensus dissolved, there was no institutional framework to preserve dominance. The mansion could project stability, but it could not enforce relevance. Its authority existed only as long as others believed in it. When beliefs shifted, the structure remained, but its meaning evaporated. The Astors responded pragmatically, though not without consequence. Properties were subdivided, sold, or repurposed. Some mansions gave way to commercial buildings, their demolition justified by market logic rather than scandal. This was not a fall marked by disgrace, but by adaptation. Yet each alteration weakened the symbolic coherence of the dynasty. What had once been a unified architectural statement fractured into transactions. The landscape of Fifth Avenue transformed from a corridor of private power into a commercial artery, and the Astor presence receded accordingly. The disappearance of these mansions from the urban fabric was often treated as progress. Newspapers framed demolition as modernization. The loss of private estates was celebrated as a victory for public access and economic growth. Few paused to consider what these buildings had represented. Not merely wealth, but an attempt to stabilize authority in a nation fundamentally resistant to hierarchy. Their removal signaled not just architectural change, but the end of a social experiment. In this sense, the Astor Mansion did not fail catastrophically. It became obsolete. Its fragility was revealed not by collapse, but by irrelevance. American high society had been built without durable foundations, reliant on symbols that could not survive systemic change. Architecture delayed this realization, but it could not prevent it. Stone endured. Power moved on. As the Astor mansions vanished, so too did the illusion that permanence could be purchased. What remained was a city less deferential, more transactional, and increasingly indifferent to inherited status. The story of these buildings is therefore not simply one of wealth gained and lost, but of authority tested and found conditional. The mansion built the Astor fortune's social legitimacy. Its disappearance exposed the limits of that legitimacy in an American context. The final chapters of this story unfold not in grand rooms, but in absence. In the spaces where mansions once stood, the city continued, unconcerned with the memory of those who had tried to command it through stone. What replaced the Astor mansions was not merely new architecture, but a new philosophy of power. Where the mansion had relied on distance, silence, and ritual, the emerging city rewarded visibility, speed, and scale. Steel frame buildings rose vertically, indifferent to lineage. Office towers generated revenue continuously, transforming land from a symbol of authority into a mechanism of productivity. The logic of permanence that had justified the Astor estates gave way to a logic of circulation. Capital moved upward and outward, no longer anchored to domestic grandeur. This shift clarified a distinction that had always been present but rarely acknowledged. The mansion was a cultural artifact, not an economic engine. It stabilized identity, not income. As long as social authority and economic power overlapped, the structure appeared secure. When those forces separated, architecture could no longer compensate. The Astors had built homes that communicated dominance in a social economy. The 20th century replaced that economy with one governed by contracts, markets, and institutions that did not recognize domestic symbolism as power. The erosion of high society did not produce immediate impoverishment. The Astors remained wealthy by any conventional measure. But wealth without centrality is different from wealth with authority. The mansion had once placed the family at the center of social gravity. Its disappearance redistributed that gravity elsewhere. Influence became diffuse, shared among corporations, political bodies, and cultural industries. No single household could claim oversight. The private sphere relinquished its role as a public regulator. This redistribution altered the meaning of legacy. For generations, legacy had been spatial. It could be walked through, hosted within, and guarded. Now it became abstract, residing in trusts, institutions, and historical memory, rather than rooms and corridors. The Astor name persisted, but without the architectural framework that had once made it unavoidable. Memory replaced presence. Archives replaced ritual. The family transitioned from actors to references. Public attitudes toward wealth also shifted. The Gilded Age had tolerated inequality as long as it appeared ordered and dignified. Mansions helped create that illusion. As urban density increased and democratic expectations expanded, conspicuous domestic dominance became less acceptable. Private grandeur invited scrutiny rather than reverence. The very features that once commanded respect now attracted criticism. Architecture, once a shield, became evidence. This change revealed a paradox at the heart of American high society. Its power depended on visibility, yet it survived through discretion. Mansions made wealth visible while attempting to render it untouchable. When visibility began to provoke resistance rather than compliance, the balance collapsed. The Astor Mansion could not retreat from view, nor could it justify itself in a society increasingly oriented toward public accountability. By mid-century, the absence of these buildings had become normalized. New generations navigated Fifth Avenue unaware that it had once been a residential frontier of elite power. The city's memory thinned. What endured was not stone, but a lesson embedded in the urban fabric. That authority built on display alone is temporary. American high society had been real, influential, and carefully engineered. It was also fragile, dependent on conditions that did not last. In retrospect, the Astor Mansion stands as both achievement and warning. It demonstrated how architecture could construct legitimacy in a young nation. It also demonstrated the limits of that construction. When the social agreement that sustained it dissolved, the building lost its purpose. No amount of craftsmanship could preserve its function. The story concludes not with condemnation, but with clarity. The mansion built the Astor fortune's social authority at a moment when such authority could be staged domestically. Its disappearance marked the end of that moment. What followed was not decay, but transformation. Power did not vanish. It changed form. And in that change, the fragility of American high society was finally exposed. The Astor Mansion's afterlife unfolded quietly, through memory rather than material. Once removed from the streetscape, its influence persisted in subtler forms, shaping how Americans understood wealth, restraint, and legitimacy. The disappearance of these houses did not erase their impact. It clarified it. Freed from physical presence, the mansion became a reference point, invoked in histories, memoirs, and urban lore as evidence of a social order that had briefly believed it could anchor itself in stone. This retrospective understanding reframed the Astor's architectural ambition. What once appeared as confidence now reads as a negotiation with uncertainty. The mansion had attempted to stabilize status in a republic that refused to sanctify hierarchy. Its success depended on shared assumptions about taste, conduct, and exclusion, assumptions that proved temporary. As those assumptions weakened, the mansion's authority dissolved, revealing the conditional nature of elite power in the United States. Unlike aristocracies supported by law and land tenure, American high society rested on consensus. When consensus shifted, architecture could not compel compliance. The cultural legacy of the Astor Mansion thus migrated into cautionary narrative. It entered a lineage of American stories that treat grandeur as provisional and ambition as double-edged. Historians began to read these houses not merely as symbols of excess, but as instruments of social engineering, carefully calibrated environments designed to regulate access, behavior, and reputation. Their failure was not moral but structural. They were built to solve a problem, how to convert wealth into authority, that the American system ultimately refused to recognize as legitimate. This refusal reshaped elite behavior across the 20th century. Subsequent generations of wealth learned from the Astor experience. They invested less in domestic display and more in institutions, philanthropy, and influence networks that operated beyond architecture. Power became quieter, more portable, less dependent on address. The absence of great urban mansions did not signal the end of inequality. It signaled the evolution of how inequality expressed itself. Authority no longer needed rooms, it needed reach. Yet the longing for permanence never fully disappeared. Periodic revivals of historic preservation, nostalgia for the Gilded Age, and fascination with vanished estates reveal an enduring attraction to the idea that architecture can still anchor meaning. Museums, exhibitions, and documentaries return to the Astor Mansion because it offers a legible past, a moment when power was visible, spatial, and therefore narratable. In studying these houses, audiences are not merely observing wealth, they are searching for coherence in a system that no longer presents it openly. The Astor Mansion also complicates the American myth of merit. Its existence underscores how success required not only accumulation, but presentation, not only labor, but lineage performance. The family's rise depended on strategic placement within social space as much as economic acumen. The mansion made that strategy visible. Its removal did not invalidate the strategy, it obscured it. What followed was a more opaque distribution of power, harder to locate and therefore harder to challenge. In this way, the mansion's disappearance intensified the very fragility it revealed. When authority no longer announces itself, it becomes resilient but elusive. The Astor era allowed society to see how power worked. The post-mansion era concealed it behind institutions and abstractions. The lesson endures. Visibility invites contestation, but invisibility ensures survival. American high society learned this lesson not through ideology, but through architecture's limits. The Astor Mansion built a fortune's social legitimacy when legitimacy could still be staged domestically. Its vanishing marked the end of that possibility. What remains is a city that absorbed the lesson and moved on, leaving behind traces that invite reflection rather than reverence. The story does not close with regret, it closes with recognition that in America power is strongest not when it stands still, but when it adapts. And that architecture, for all its grandeur, is only ever a temporary solution. By the time the Astor Mansion had fully receded from the physical city, its meaning had shifted from lived environment to historical evidence. What had once operated as an active instrument of social regulation now existed as an archive of intentions. Scholars, urban planners, and cultural historians began to treat these vanished houses as case studies in how power behaves when it lacks formal protection. The Astor Mansion became less a story of decline than a diagnostic tool, revealing the mechanics of authority in a society that insists it does not have an aristocracy. This reevaluation altered how the Gilded Age itself was understood. Earlier interpretations framed the period as an excess corrected by reform, a moral imbalance resolved through progressive legislation. The Astor Mansion complicates that narrative. It shows that elite power was not simply curtailed by law, but reorganized by structure. When architecture could no longer serve as a stabilizing device, power migrated toward forms that were less visible and therefore less vulnerable. The mansion's failure did not democratize authority, it redistributed it. In this redistribution, the city played an active role. New York's evolution rewarded density over distinction, efficiency over ceremony. The replacement of mansions with commercial structures did more than increase tax revenue. It dissolved the spatial logic that had supported social hierarchy. Where once a single household commanded an entire block, thousands of offices now share the same footprint. Authority fragmented, influence became collective, negotiated, and increasingly impersonal. The Astor Mansion, designed to centralize prestige, could not survive in an environment that rewarded dispersion. Yet the emotional residue of these spaces persisted. Even in absence, they exerted influence through memory. Literature, photography, and oral history preserved impressions of rooms, staircases, and facades that no longer existed. These recollections were often tinged with ambivalence. Admiration coexisted with critique. Grandeur was acknowledged, but so was its artificiality. The mansion became a symbol not of success, but of effort. The effort required to sustain a social order that never fully belonged. This ambivalence reflects a broader American tension. The nation remains fascinated by wealth while remaining uneasy with its permanence. The Astor Mansion embodied that contradiction. It sought to normalize inequality through aesthetics, to make dominance appear orderly and therefore acceptable. Its removal did not resolve the contradiction, it displaced it. Inequality persisted, but without the architectural vocabulary that had once framed it as tradition. In modern retrospection, the Astor story often invites moralization, but the mansion resists simple judgment. It was neither villain nor victim. It was an experiment, conducted openly, in a society that had not yet decided what to do with extreme private power. The experiment revealed that architecture could slow social change, but not redirect it. It could persuade, but only temporarily. Once the underlying conditions shifted, persuasion lost its force. The final significance of the Astor Mansion lies in what it teaches about visibility. Power that announces itself invites challenge. Power that embeds itself in systems survives longer. The Gilded Age elite learned this lesson unevenly, and the Astors learned it publicly. Their mansions were legible statements in a city that was learning to read differently. When the audience changed, the message no longer landed. This realization reframes fragility as a structural condition rather than a personal failing. American high society was fragile because it depended on shared belief without institutional guarantee. The mansion attempted to compensate for that absence. Its disappearance confirmed that compensation was insufficient. Authority in the United States would henceforth require adaptability over display, networks over neighborhoods, abstraction over architecture. As this documentary moves toward its conclusion, the Astor Mansion remains central not because it survived, but because it did not. Its absence speaks more clearly than its presence ever could. It marks the boundary between two eras of power, one spatial and ceremonial, the other systemic and concealed. Understanding that boundary is essential to understanding how American wealth continues to operate long after the last stone was removed. The Astor Mansion's disappearance also altered how power narrated itself. Without a physical anchor, elite identity shifted toward story rather than space. Memoirs replaced rooms. Philanthropic foundations replaced ballrooms. Influence was curated through boards, endowments, and affiliations that left fewer architectural traces. This transition did not diminish power. It refined it. What could no longer be displayed openly was managed discreetly, embedded within institutions that appeared neutral, civic, or benevolent. This evolution reframed the relationship between wealth and the public. In the Gilded Age, mansions made inequality visible and therefore legible. They invited both admiration and resentment. Their scale clarified who stood above whom. Once removed, inequality became harder to map. The Astor Mansion had provided a focal point for social imagination. Its absence dispersed attention, making power less confrontational and more difficult to contest. The city gained density but lost a certain clarity. The fragility exposed by the Astor experience thus carried an unexpected consequence. High society did not collapse because its architecture failed. It transformed because architecture revealed too much. The mansion exposed the mechanics of exclusion, the labor behind refinement, the effort required to sustain hierarchy. As democratic norms expanded, such exposure became a liability. Privacy, once a privilege, became a strategy. Power withdrew from domestic display and embedded itself in procedures, regulations, and cultural capital. This withdrawal altered the emotional texture of wealth. The Astor Mansion had been theatrical, even when restrained. Its rooms staged encounters, enforced silence, and measured worth through proximity. The new forms of power were less tactile. They operated through documents, meetings, and influence that left no single place to observe. For historians, this shift complicates interpretation. Stone can be measured. Absence requires inference. The mansion's destruction therefore marked a turning point, not only in social practice, but in historical visibility. Yet traces remain in the urban logic that followed. Fifth Avenue's transformation into a commercial corridor did not erase its elite origins. It repurposed them. Prestige persisted, but attached itself to brands rather than families, to consumption rather than residence. The avenue remained a site of aspiration, but the aspiration changed form. Where once one aspired to enter a drawing room, now one aspired to access markets, platforms, and visibility itself. The Astor Mansion's logic survived, stripped of its domestic shell. In this continuity, the mansion's lesson deepens. It reveals that fragility does not mean weakness. It means dependence. American high society depended on conditions that favored display and consensus. When those conditions shifted, it adapted by abandoning the very symbols that had defined it. The Astors did not lose because they were imprudent. They lost a stage that no longer served its purpose. The enduring relevance of this story lies in its restraint. There is no dramatic collapse, no singular betrayal, no final scandal. The mansion fades because the world around it changes. Its authority evaporates because authority itself adopts a different grammar. This quiet ending is precisely what makes it instructive. Power rarely announces its transformations. It absorbs them. The Astor Mansion built a fortune's social meaning in an era when meaning could be spatially enforced. Its disappearance exposed the fragility of that enforcement in a society committed, at least rhetorically, to mobility and equality. What followed was not the end of elite power, but its reconfiguration. Understanding that reconfiguration requires returning to the moment when architecture still believed it could hold authority in place. The next and final part turns outward, examining what the Astor Mansion ultimately tells us about American power today and why its absence continues to shape how wealth, legitimacy, and silence operate in the modern world. Seen from the present, the Astor Mansion reads less like a relic and more like a diagram. It maps a moment when American power attempted to anchor itself visibly, spatially, and domestically, and discovered the limits of that strategy. The mansion promised stability by fixing authority in place. The century that followed demonstrated that American authority endures not by standing still, but by remaining elusive. What the Astors built with stone, later elites learned to build with systems. This continuity explains why the mansion still matters. It clarifies a pattern that repeats beyond the Gilded Age. Whenever power becomes legible, it attracts pressure. Whenever it becomes theatrical, it invites reform. The Astor Mansion condensed wealth, culture, and exclusion into a form that could be seen, criticized, and ultimately dismantled. Its disappearance did not democratize influence, it changed how influence hides. The lesson is not that architecture failed, but that visibility carries cost. In contemporary America, authority rarely announces itself through residence. It circulates through corporate governance, regulatory capture, philanthropic branding, and cultural platforms that distribute presence without concentration. These forms are harder to contest precisely because they lack a single address. The Astor Mansion reminds us that when power had an address, it could be confronted. When it does not, it persists with less friction. Fragility in this sense belongs not to wealth itself, but to the forms through which wealth chooses to appear. The Astor story also reframes ambition. The family's achievement was not merely accumulation, it was coordination of space, ritual, and reputation. Their limitation was structural, not moral. They built for a society that was already passing. The mansion achieved its purpose for a time, then outlived it. That arc, construction, dominance, obsolescence, mirrors the rhythm of American institutions that mistake scale for permanence. What remains is not nostalgia, but instruction. The mansion teaches that authority requires constant translation into forms a society recognizes. When recognition changes, symbols must change with it. Stone was once persuasive. It no longer is. The Astors discover this publicly through demolition rather than disgrace. Their experience exposes a central truth of American power. It is strongest when it abandons display and most vulnerable when it insists on being seen. To stand on Fifth Avenue today is to encounter this lesson without realizing it. The absence of mansions is itself a presence, a reminder that power once tried to root itself here and learn to move on. The city absorbed the change, as it always does. What it did not absorb was the illusion that authority can be fixed. That illusion belonged to a brief moment when architecture believed it could stabilize society. The mansion built the Astor fortune's social legitimacy by translating wealth into space. Its disappearance revealed that legitimacy in America is provisional, contingent, and subject to renegotiation. In tracing this history, we do not witness a fall from grace, but a recalibration. Power shed a skin that no longer served it. The stone was removed. The systems remained. The Astor Mansion does not survive as a building, but it endures as a boundary marker in the history of American power. It marks the point at which authority attempted to become fixed, visible, and unquestioned, and discovered that such conditions could not be sustained in a society built on mobility, negotiation, and continual reinvention. What the Astors constructed was not merely a residence, but a hypothesis that wealth translated into architecture and ritual could stabilize social hierarchy in a republic that denied formal aristocracy. The mansion tested that hypothesis in full public view. For a time, the test succeeded. Stone, space, and ceremony aligned with a cultural moment that still valued restraint, distance, and inherited legitimacy. The mansion disciplined behavior, regulated access, and shaped the city's social imagination. It gave form to an elite consensus that accepted inequality as long as it appeared ordered and contained. But consensus is not permanence. When economic structures shifted, when urban life accelerated, and when democratic expectations hardened, the mansion's authority weakened. It could not adapt without ceasing to be what it was. The disappearance of the Astor mansions was therefore not an accident of development, nor a moral reckoning imposed from outside. It was the natural outcome of a misalignment between form and function. Architecture had attempted to do what institutions now do more efficiently: coordinate influence, obscure effort, and normalize advantage. Once institutions assumed that role, domestic grandeur became redundant. The mansion had solved a problem that no longer existed in the same form. This ending carries no spectacle. There is no final scandal, no dramatic dispossession, no singular moment of collapse. The Astors remained wealthy. Their name persisted. What vanished was a way of making power legible. The mansion's removal signaled that American authority no longer wished to be seen so clearly. What followed was not the end of elite dominance, but its migration into systems that operate without facades. In this sense, the fragility exposed by the Astor Mansion was never personal. It was structural. American high society was fragile because it depended on shared belief rather than formal entitlement. Architecture attempted to compensate for that absence. It delayed change, but it could not arrest it. When belief shifted, stone became mute. The city continued. Power adjusted. To understand the Astor Mansion, then, is not to mourn its loss, but to recognize its instruction. It teaches that, in America, authority is provisional, negotiated, and responsive to context. When it becomes too visible, it invites resistance. When it becomes too rigid, it is replaced. The mansion believed it could stand still and command. The nation proved otherwise. What remains is an absence that still speaks. Fifth Avenue, dense and commercial, carries no memory of drawing rooms or guarded thresholds, yet it operates within a logic shaped by what once stood there. Prestige endures, but detached from residence. Influence persists, but stripped of address. The Astor Mansion did not fail because it was excessive. It failed because it was honest, honest about how power once worked. In tracing its rise and disappearance, we are left with a clearer understanding of American wealth, not as something that anchors itself, but as something that survives by moving, adapting, and withdrawing from view. The mansion recorded a moment when power believed it could be fixed in stone. History recorded the correction. That is its legacy, not ruin but revelation.